In the spring of 1191, a group of Benedictine monks at Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have discovered Excalibur and the remains of King Arthur. Deep in the South Cemetery, somewhere between two weathered stone pyramids that had stood on Abbey grounds since before anyone alive could remember, they started digging. They didn't dig randomly. Word had gone round that Henry II, before his passing, had been told the location of a very particular grave by an old Welsh bard. The monks were in desperate need of pilgrims and royal money after a catastrophic 1184 fire that had gutted the abbey's old church and incinerated most of its ancient relic collection. They had every reason in the world to trust that rumor and follow where it led. What they claimed to find, roughly 16 feet down, was a hollowed oak trunk containing the remains of a very tall man and a shorter woman whose blonde hair was still preserved. Wedged under a stone slab, they recovered a cross inscribed with a Latin legend identifying the grave's occupant as the famous King Arthur, buried on the Isle of Avalon. The cross itself was roughly a foot long and rendered in a deliberately archaic style, as if to suggest it belonged to a much older age. Gerald of Wales, who visited the abbey shortly after the dig, wrote two separate accounts of what he'd seen and heard there, and he actually returned years later to produce a more elaborate version. According to him, the bones of the man were enormous, and bore the marks of 10 grievous wounds, with one to the skull that had clearly been mortal. Exactly when Excalibur first appears in the story is the first puzzle piece in this historical mystery. Gerald's earliest account, written roughly a year after the dig, doesn't mention a weapon at all. Later chroniclers, working a generation or two after the discovery, would eventually mention that an extraordinary sword had come out of the grave along with the bones. Ralph of Coggeshall, one of the earliest chroniclers to firmly date the event to 1191, wasn't especially interested in the sword either, which seems quite bizarre. It only emerged gradually, as if the object had been retroactively stitched into the legend over the generations. Here's the thing, though. Whether or not a sword came out of the Glastonbury dig, there's something we know for certain. We know that at the exact same time, a sword claimed to be Arthur's did exist in the hands of the English crown. We know this because Roger of Howden, a royal clerk who traveled with the king and had access to the king's own retinue, recorded what happened with it. In early 1191, just as the monks at Glastonbury were either excavating their grave or getting ready to, King Richard I was wintering in Sicily on his way to the Third Crusade. He was in a tricky spot, and his sister Joan, widow of the recently deceased Sicilian king, had been effectively imprisoned by the new ruler, Tancred of Lecce. Richard had already muscled his way into Messina, rattled the cages of the locals, extracted his sister, and squeezed a hefty ransom out of Tancred. Over the following months, the two men moved from open hostility to an uneasy alliance. They met at Catania and hammered out an agreement, and to seal the friendship, Richard handed Tancred a gift. The gift was a sword, and according to Howden, Richard presented it as the very blade of King Arthur, the weapon the Britons had called Caliburn. This is the sword that most of us today recognize under its later name popularized in Arthurian romances, Excalibur. Tancred, for his part, didn't come empty-handed. Far from it. He returned the favor with 15 galleys and 4 large troop transport ships, a considerably more practical offering for a man about to cross the Mediterranean with an army. This is a well-documented exchange, and it's mentioned not just by Howden, but also in other chronicles of the period. This is where the timing of the Glastonbury excavation and Richard's gift has tantalized historians for centuries, since both happened in 1191 and both involve a sword tied to King Arthur. Richard was Henry II's son, and it was Henry who'd allegedly set the Glastonbury monks on their hunt in the first place. So, is this the same sword? Did Richard take a freshly excavated weapon out of a Somerset grave, carry it across Europe, and hand it to a Sicilian king? The honest answer is that we don't know, and the chronicle evidence doesn't quite line up. If the bones and grave goods came out of the ground in 1191, Richard had probably already left England with his version of Excalibur by the time the monks found theirs. But medieval chronology is notoriously slippery, and some scholars have argued the dig may have happened slightly earlier than the traditional date. Alternatively, it's been argued that news of a discovery could have reached Richard before he sailed. Others think the Glastonbury sword was a separate object entirely, one whose existence was invented or elaborated after the fact to tie the abbey more firmly to the Arthurian legend. Many historians believe that the most likely explanation is that Richard's blade had no real connection to Glastonbury. It may have been a ceremonial blade from Richard's own armory, rebranded for diplomatic purposes. Calling it Excalibur made a fine gift feel priceless, and medieval kings were perfectly comfortable using legendary provenance to elevate ordinary objects. For example, there's potentially as many as 4 versions of the Holy Lance floating around, despite the fact that there could only logically be one. Tancred, for his part, almost certainly didn't care whether the sword was genuinely Arthur's, but the fact that it was perceived as such. What mattered was that a powerful English king thought highly enough of him to give away something called Excalibur, and the story itself was the object. Whatever the truth of the sword, the grave itself became a durable political asset for the English crown. In 1278, Edward I visited Glastonbury with his queen, Eleanor of Castile. The royal couple oversaw a solemn ceremony in which the supposed bones of Arthur and Guinevere were transferred to a new black marble tomb in front of the high altar. Edward handled the skull of the man, while Eleanor handled the skull of the woman, and the timing wasn't accidental. Edward was deep in his long campaign to subdue Wales, and Welsh resistance had leaned heavily on the old prophecy that Arthur would one day return to drive the English out. Parading Arthur in front of the high altar at Glastonbury was a political argument dressed up as a religious ceremony. The tomb stood in the abbey for another 2.5 centuries, and pilgrims came, paid, and left, while writers and poets embellished the legend further. Then, in 1539, Henry VIII's commissioners arrived, and Glastonbury, one of the wealthiest monastic houses in England, had defied the royal orders for dissolution. The abbey was seized, and its last abbot, Richard Whiting, was convicted on trumped-up charges of treason and hanged. The abbey buildings were systematically stripped and the stone carted off for building work. Somewhere in the chaos, the black marble tomb and whatever remains it held disappeared, and they've never been found. The bodies of Arthur and Guinevere, or whatever had passed as their remains, also vanished. And what of the sword itself? If it ever was at Glastonbury, it had already been gone by the time Edward reburied the bones. It seems unlikely that Glastonbury would have simply lost track of such a revered object, especially given the popularity of Arthurian legend and the revenue it could have generated. If that's correct, given that it was Richard's father, Henry II, who commissioned the dig, it makes sense that something of such great value would have been given to the crown. And in that case, if it's the weapon Richard gave to Tancred, its trail is even colder, though of course it's just as likely that Richard simply gave Tancred another version. Tancred himself ruled Sicily for another 3 years before his own early passing. The kingdom fell into chaos and was ultimately conquered by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who absorbed the treasures of the Sicilian court into his own possessions. From there, the trail vanishes completely, and no later chronicler reports seeing Arthur's sword in any European treasury. No inventory of royal arms mentions it, and it isn't recorded as loot, as a gift, as a prize, or as a relic anywhere after Tancred's hand. The most likely explanation of what happened to this blade is the most ordinary one. It was melted down, reforged, or lost during one of the upheavals that swept through southern Italy and the Holy Roman Empire in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Swords are practical objects, and a sword that's become a legendary curiosity in one court can easily be stripped of its hilt, rebladed, or broken up for its metal by the next. Excalibur, if it ever existed in any physical form, probably ended its life the same way most medieval swords did, as scrap. It's also theoretically possible that Tancred politely declined the gift in private, though there's no evidence to suggest this was the case. If this is what happened, and this is entirely speculative, then it may have ventured along with Richard's retinue into the Holy Land, where it may have been lost. There was also a subtle tradition of politely declining in medieval Christendom, especially when accepting a gift might imply subordination. If a gift of relatively equal value couldn't be produced by the other ruler, the tradition was, generally speaking, to decline the gift in an extremely discreet way. Given the behavior of Richard while in Sicily, accepting a gift of theoretically infinite value could have been interpreted as a sign of vassalage by Sicily to England. Since both men ruled as kings, both of the same rank and theoretically the same status, this would have been unacceptable. While Tancred did give very valuable gifts in return, ultimately, if anyone truly believed this was the greatest sword in history, a handful of ships likely wouldn't have been a value match. Again, I do have to stress that this is speculative and my own theory, not a theory that has been endorsed by any historians, but I do personally see it as plausible. Notably, in the 1960s, an archaeologist excavated the southern cemetery at Glastonbury and confirmed that a large pit had indeed been dug there in the late 12th century. This was right where the chroniclers said it was. But what actually came out of that pit is another question entirely. In the end, we already knew Gerald of Wales had seen the pit with his own eyes, so without further evidence of what was there, this did little to change the historical narrative about the excavation. The sword Richard carried to Sicily and the sword the monks supposedly pulled from the earth at Glastonbury may never have been the same object. There's a realistic possibility that the sword was never actually even found at Glastonbury, and the entire thing was a fabrication. In that case, the well-attested gift given to Tancred just happens to be one of the most bizarre chronological coincidences of medieval history. Whatever the case, the fate of the one, or perhaps two, Excaliburs of 1191 remains an unsolved historical mystery. In the summer of 1187, a rumor started drifting through the French court that would have made any medieval gossip-monger's day. Richard, heir to the English throne, and already one of the most famous fighting men in Europe, was sharing a bed with Philip II of France. This wasn't metaphorical, and they were actually sharing a bed every night, according to one of the most reliable chroniclers of the age. Nearly 900 years later, historians are still arguing about what it meant. The bed-sharing claim comes from Roger of Howden, a royal clerk who served in the court of Henry II and had direct access to the people he was writing about. In his account of 1187, Howden describes how Richard and Philip grew so close during their negotiations in Paris that they ate from the same dish and at night slept in the same bed. He adds that Henry II, Richard's father, was startled and troubled by the intensity of the emotional bond between the two young men. Howden wasn't writing from hearsay, and he'd spent years in royal service, traveled with the crusading army, and tended to record what he'd seen himself, or could verify. When he describes Richard and Philip sharing a bed, he's describing something close enough to the surface of court life that the king's own clerks already knew about it. That's the passage, that's the whole thing, and there are no inferences made. For nearly 800 years, scholars didn't treat it as especially remarkable, because bed sharing between men in the medieval world wasn't, on its own, a statement. Kings, nobles, and total strangers shared beds for warmth, for security, and as a public demonstration of political trust. A shared bed meant a shared alliance, and it meant you trusted someone enough to sleep next to them, while armed retainers stood in the hall outside. It didn't necessarily mean there was anything more going on, though of course sometimes there was. Then, in 1948, an English historian pushed the idea in a popular biography that Richard's bond with Philip might have been something more than political theater. Then, in 1980, a Yale professor took the claim seriously in a sweeping study of high-level gay romance in medieval Christendom. He argued that the chronicle passage, read closely, carried clear romantic undertones, and that earlier historians had been reading past the obvious interpretation. To understand why anyone cares, it helps to remember who Richard actually was. Born at Beaumont Palace in Oxford in September 1157, he was one of the younger sons of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. This meant he wasn't originally expected to inherit the English throne, that he was a backup plan. He grew up speaking Occitan and French rather than English, and by his early 20s he was one of the most feared battlefield commanders of his era. He took the cross in 1187, became king in 1189 after his father's death, and led the Third Crusade against Saladin. He cultivated a reputation for personal bravery that stood out even in an age that prized warrior kings, and the nickname Lionheart didn't come from nowhere. He was also, by every contemporary account, unusually close to Philip II. But the chroniclers keep reaching for language that seems to strain the usual vocabulary of royal friendship. Gerald of Wales, writing a few years later, described their affection in terms that don't quite fit the standard template for political allies. He described the King of France as loving Richard a bit more than was proper, which could imply a romantic relationship. That said, another reading suggests Philip may have simply put his love for Richard above matters of state. The second piece of evidence, and for many researchers the more suggestive one, turns up in 1195. Richard had recently returned to his French territories after his imprisonment in Germany and was trying to reassert his authority. According to Howden again, a hermit approached the king and warned him to remember the destruction of Sodom and to abstain from what was unlawful. The hermit said that if he didn't, divine vengeance was coming, and Richard, the story goes, ignored the warning at first, then fell seriously ill. Taking the illness as a sign, he summoned his priests, confessed, took back his estranged wife Berengaria of Navarre, and did public penance. The word Sodom is doing a lot of work in that passage, and in 12th century writing, this was largely understood as a reference to romantic activity between men. However, it wasn't exclusively used for this purpose, and it occasionally meant adultery more generally, or simply just unrighteous behavior. But the fact is, Howden used the phrase deliberately, and he decided to record the words of a hermit, and he used the words about a specific king he personally served. He doesn't make the same accusation about any of the other English monarchs he covered in his works, so whatever he meant something particular to Richard. Richard's illness, the separation from his wife, and the public penance are all on solid historical ground. Berengaria, whom Richard had married at Limassol in Cyprus in May 1191 on his way to the Holy Land, had effectively been absent from his daily life for years. The scale of the penance gesture, a public act of contrition from a reigning king in the 1190s, wasn't a formality. It meant humbling himself before clergy in the open, receiving the kind of rebuke normally reserved for lesser men, and doing it where courtiers and foreign envoys could see. After 1195, the couple reconciled, at least publicly, though they never had children. For much of the 20th century, the consensus among English historians was that the bed-sharing passage was political theater. The Hermit's Warning, for its part, was moral boilerplate aimed at a king whose sins were probably adultery, and the whole gay Richard reading was a modern projection onto a medieval man. In general these days, men don't tend to spend the night with each other, cuddled up in bed, unless they have romantic feelings for one another. We do know for a fact that in medieval times this was something that was often done without any romantic feelings involved. It's easy to simply take our modern societal standards and project them backwards on people living in a completely different social context. However, the fact remains that the chroniclers were very clear that the two men possessed a deep passion for one another, which adds another layer of complexity to the bed sharing. Richard is also believed to have fathered at least one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, who shows up later in the historical record as a minor French noble. However, of course, even if that is true, that doesn't necessarily prove that Richard didn't also engage in relationships with men. On the other side, historians sympathetic to the revisionist reading argue that the political alliance explanation only stretches so far before it snaps. Medieval chroniclers had a standard vocabulary for political closeness, and the passages about the two suggest something very intense. They also point out that Howden was not a sensationalist. He wrote dryly, he was close to the royal household, and he had every reason to present the king flatteringly. If his account sounded, to his contemporaries, a little too intimate, that's meaningful precisely because he was the sort of chronicler to present something so intimate very delicately. But that brings me to another point. None of Richard's enemies, and he had many, ever accused him of having romantic attachments to other men. To me, that suggests that his time in bed with his good friend Philip might have just been that, and nothing more. They may have just two dudes who enjoyed a Bert and Ernie style friendship, as was the style amongst the high nobility at the time. Notably, some believers in the theory that King Richard had a strong preference for romantic involvement with other men suggest that he should have had more illegitimate offspring. This was an age when medieval kings or dukes would produce an absolute trove of children by a variety of different women. King Richard, for a guy who got around vast geographic areas, produced one son, and even that isn't clear from the records. Richard was a king, a crusader, a soldier, a difficult son, an absent husband, and depending on how you read the evidence, potentially gay or bi as well. The sources don't give us a verdict on this historical mystery, and unless something new is uncovered, they never will. All they give us is a man who spent a night in a bed in Paris in the summer of 1187, a chronicler who thought it was worth recording, and some modern arguments about what it meant. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. As usual, the biggest thing you can do to help out my channel aside from watching is clicking that share button and sending it. Of all the folklore attached to the Tudor dynasty, few are as bizarre or as persistent as the legend of the Bisley Boy. The claim, stripped to its essentials, is extraordinary, that the girl known to history as Elizabeth I died as a child. She was then secretly replaced by a boy from the Gloucestershire village of Bisley, who then went on to rule England for 45 years, disguised as a woman. It touches on real gaps in the historical record and plays on genuine mysteries surrounding Elizabeth's personal life, but upon close historical examination, it all falls apart entirely. The tale's most commonly cited origin traces back to the Reverend Thomas Keble, a Victorian clergyman who served as vicar of Bisley in the mid-19th century. According to local tradition, Keble discovered the remains of a young girl in a stone coffin during construction work in the village. The coffin was reportedly found in what had once been the grounds of Overcourt, a manor house where the young Princess Elizabeth is believed to have stayed during parts of her childhood. Keble apparently connected the discovery to a local legend already circulating in the village, one that claimed the young princess had died there during a visit. Now, it's important to mention here that this was unwritten local folklore filtered through Keble, who clearly had a narrative he wanted to weave, so keep that in mind. In this telling, she had been hastily replaced by a local child to avoid the wrath of her father, Henry VIII, who, as you may have heard, wasn't the most reasonable man in history. The story gained significantly wider exposure when Bram Stoker, best known for Dracula, included a detailed account of the legend in his 1910 book, Famous Impostors. Stoker presented the tale with a degree of credulity that surprised many of his readers, spending a full chapter laying out the supposed evidence. He treated it as a genuinely plausible historical scenario rather than mere village gossip. His retelling gave the myth a literary respectability it hadn't previously enjoyed, and ensured it would reach far beyond a localized audience. Stoker ultimately drew on the Keble tradition and on various circumstantial oddities about Elizabeth's life. While the work was roundly dismissed by scholars at the time, it has enough of a factual basis to convince many educated people it was theoretically plausible. The core narrative of the legend runs roughly as follows. Sometime around 1543 or 1544, when Elizabeth was approximately 10 years old, she was sent away to the countryside to escape an outbreak of plague that was then sweeping through London. She was placed in the care of her governess, Cat Ashley, at Overcourt in Bisley. And I just have to take a moment here to point out that the name Cat Ashley is a great example of the so-called Tiffany effect. This is an observation that many historically valid names can sound ahistorical, given how modern they sound, but I'm clearly digressing here. While staying there, Elizabeth fell gravely ill and died, and fear set into everyone entrusted to her care. Ashley and those in the immediate household panicked, knowing that Henry VIII was due to visit shortly, and were worried they would be executed for letting anything happen to Elizabeth. In their desperation, they searched the village for a child of similar age and pale coloring who could pass as the princess. The only suitable candidate they could find was a boy, a young redhead from a local family who bore just enough resemblance to Elizabeth to serve as a temporary stand-in. According to the legend, the deception was intended to be brief, but proved impossible to undo. The boy was dressed in Elizabeth's clothes, presented to Henry, and the substitution was never revealed. From that point forward, this unnamed village boy lived as Elizabeth, eventually ascending to the throne in 1558 and ruling until 1603. The legend uses this supposed switch to explain several well-known aspects of Elizabeth's life and reign. Proponents of the Bisley Boy theory have, over the years, pointed to a handful of historical curiosities to support their case. Elizabeth's lifelong refusal to marry is the most frequently cited piece of supposed evidence. Despite enormous political pressure from her council and parliament, she never took a husband. The legend's supporters argue this was because marriage would have required a level of what I'll politely call physical intimacy that would have exposed the deception, to put it mildly. Related to this is the Queen's well-documented insistence on privacy regarding her body. She controlled access to her bedchamber with what proponents claim was unusual rigor, and her ladies of the bedchamber were carefully selected and sworn to discretion. There's also the matter of Elizabeth's physical appearance, and contemporaries sometimes commented on her strong features and her height, which was notable for a woman of the period. However, they never commented that she appeared to be a man, but rather that she ruled with the authority expected of a man of the era, an important distinction. The legend latches onto these descriptions as evidence that the queen was biologically male. Additionally, Elizabeth famously ordered that no post-mortem examination be performed on her body after death, a request that was honored. Supporters of the myth treat this as a final act of concealment, a last effort to ensure the secret died with the impersonator. The discovery in Bisley itself adds a layer of physical evidence, assuming of course that it is true as reported by Keble. The stone coffin Keble reportedly found contained the remains of a girl dressed in fine Tudor-era clothing. The clothing, they argue, was far too expensive for a commoner and must have belonged to someone of high status. However, this of course fails to note that the area was home to rural nobility regardless, individuals of sufficient wealth to host a princess. It seems likely to me that this coffin may have contained the remains of a relative of one of these wealthy and powerful local nobles. Historians have consistently and firmly rejected the Bisley Boy legend, and the reasons for this aren't hard to understand. The logistical impossibilities alone are staggering. Elizabeth was not an obscure or unobserved figure, even as a child. She was a princess of England, educated by some of the finest tutors in the country, and she was surrounded by courtiers, servants, and family members from birth. The idea that a village boy with no education, no courtly training, and no knowledge of Elizabeth's personal history could have seamlessly replaced her is absurd. For instance, Elizabeth was already literate in multiple languages by the age of 10, and the idea of a local peasant child being literate in even English was exceedingly unlikely. She had established relationships with her siblings, her stepmothers, and numerous members of the court. A substitution of this kind would have required not just a physical resemblance, but an instant mastery of languages, manners, handwriting, and personal knowledge that no child could have faked. There's also the matter of the supposed cover-up lasting for 60 years without a single credible leak. Tudor England was a hotbed of political intrigue, factional warfare, and religious conflict. Elizabeth had powerful enemies throughout her life, from Catholic conspirators to rival claimants to the throne. If there had been even a whisper of evidence that she wasn't who she claimed to be, her opponents would have seized upon it with devastating effect. No contemporary source, hostile or otherwise, ever suggested anything of the kind. That silence on this point from Elizabeth's many enemies is perhaps the most damning evidence against the legend. The circumstantial evidence cited by proponents also crumbles under closer examination. Elizabeth's refusal to marry can be far more convincingly explained by political calculation, personal preference, and the traumatic experiences of her youth. After all, she lived through the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and the fates of several of her father's other wives were famously grim as well. I think this makes it quite likely that she would have a very unusual and perhaps very unhealthy view of interpersonal relationships and the institution of marriage. Also, it's worth noting that she had many suitors throughout the years, and some of them fell through, not due to personal reasons, but due to political realities. As for her insistence on bodily privacy, this was consistent with the behavior of other monarchs of the period, and doesn't require much more to explain, but there is a bit more to it. This insistence on privacy was also a matter of personal security, considering the extreme threats she was under at various times in her reign. In fact, there were numerous credible threats against Elizabeth's life throughout her reign, so the idea that she was obsessed with security should come as no surprise. Despite being thoroughly debunked, the Bisley Boy legend has shown a remarkable ability to persist and even thrive in popular culture. The village of Bisley itself has leaned into the association, with local traditions and tourist interest keeping the story alive. It continues to circulate online, where it finds new audiences who encounter it stripped of scholarly context and sometimes presented at face value. Personally, I think the legend's remarkable staying power comes from the fact that it taps into the real fascination people have with Elizabeth. She's undoubtedly one of the most studied people in English history, but she's also perhaps England's most enigmatic ruler. Elizabeth was able to bend reality around her in her life through her sheer force of personality. Elizabeth was, by any reasonable and rigorous historical assessment, exactly who she said she was. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a formidably intelligent and politically astute ruler who navigated one of the most dangerous and turbulent periods in history. The Bisley Boy is a good story, undeniably entertaining and just plausible enough to make you pause for a moment before reason reasserts itself. But it remains what it has always been, a latter-day legend, a curious piece of Victorian lore dressed up in Tudor clothing, and nothing more. When the Aztecs stumbled upon Teotihuacan sometime in the 14th century, the people who'd built it had already been gone for roughly 700 years. The palaces stood empty, the murals were fading, and the avenues that once held a population of more than 100,000 lay overgrown and silent. Someone had raised pyramids on a scale rivaling anything in the ancient world, and then they'd simply vanished. We don't know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, or even what they called their own city. Most people don't really grasp the scale of this place. At its peak in the 5th century AD, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on Earth, with a population that modern estimates put at up to 200,000 residents at its peak. That made it bigger than any city in contemporary Europe and roughly comparable in footprint to classical Rome. It covered about 8 square miles in the highlands of central Mexico, roughly 30 miles northeast of where Mexico City sits today. The city had been laid out on a deliberate grid, organized along a broad ceremonial axis that the Aztecs would later name the Avenue of the Dead. At its northern end rose the Pyramid of the Moon, and partway down stood the Pyramid of the Sun. This pyramid climbs more than 200 feet into the air, and its base footprint approaches that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, though it's considerably shorter. Further south sat the Ciudadela and the ornate Temple of the Feathered Serpent, its facade carved with alternating heads of serpents, and what scholars still debate might be a storm god. Everything had once been plastered and painted in brilliant reds and greens, making this city look otherworldly. It was presided over by a society that, at its height, projected cultural influence from the northern deserts down into the Maya lowlands of modern Guatemala. We haven't decoded the writing of the people who lived at Teotihuacan, and instead we know of this power from archaeological evidence and the writings of other people. In January of 378 AD, a warrior whose name roughly translates to "Fire is Born" arrived at the great Maya city of Tikal, something we know from Mayan sources. Mayan sources indicate that he was either from Teotihuacan or came from a state that was allied to the city. On the very same day, Tikal's reigning king died according to a monument later erected there. A new dynasty took power, one that kept ties to Teotihuacan and adopted Teotihuacan's weapons and iconography. Whether this was a full military conquest, a diplomatic installation, or something fuzzier is still debated, but Tikal was never quite the same afterward. But here's the thing. The name Teotihuacan isn't what the builders called it. It's Nahuatl, the language of the much later Aztecs, and it roughly means the place where the gods were born. The Aztecs pinned that name on the ruins centuries after the city's fall, having wandered into the wreckage and concluded that only divine beings could have raised such structures. Whatever the original inhabitants called their home, the answer is lost. This is where the story gets stranger, since the Aztecs didn't just encounter the ruins. Instead, they built their entire creation mythology around them. In their cosmology, Teotihuacan was the sacred spot where the current age of the world, the fifth sun, had been forged. A once humble and meager god named Nanahuatzin threw himself into a primordial fire and emerged as the sun in the sky. The Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, made pilgrimages there, folded its architectural grammar into their own capital at Tenochtitlan, and even dug into the pyramids looking for relics. They were obsessed with the culture of the people who built this site. But they had no real idea who had built it, and they guessed that it must have been the work of a legendary race of giants called the Quinametsin. However, this wasn't universally accepted, and as they developed their own complex society with a scholarly class, more theories arose. Some of their chroniclers proposed the Toltecs as candidates, though that suggestion stretched across timelines that don't actually line up. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century and began transcribing Aztec oral traditions, they inherited all of this confusion unfiltered. For centuries afterward, educated opinion ricocheted between various candidates, including the Toltecs, the Olmecs, and the Totonacs, amongst others. At one particularly embarrassing moment in Victorian-era speculation, lost travelers from Atlantis were suggested. Almost none of these early guesses survived serious scrutiny, Atlanteans among them. The first substantial breakthroughs came in the 20th century when systematic archaeological mapping finally began. A long-running survey project based out of the University of Rochester in the 1960s cataloged something close to 5,000 visible structures across the site. What they found pointed to a planned, state-directed urbanism, far more sophisticated than earlier scholars had assumed. This wasn't a city that had grown organically outward from a village. It appeared to have been designed from the beginning. More importantly for our specific historical mystery, the archaeology revealed that Teotihuacan was multi-ethnic from a very early date. Excavations uncovered distinct neighborhoods occupied by people from Oaxaca, hundreds of miles to the south, who kept their own pottery styles and burial customs for generations. Another district contained residents with links to the Gulf Coast and the Maya lowlands. People were flowing into this city from all over Mesoamerica, which raises more questions about who founded it in the first place and why. One long-running theory involves a now nearly forgotten city called Cuicuilco. Around the turn of the eras on our calendars from BC to AD, Cuicuilco was one of the major urban centers in the basin of Mexico. Its fortunes declined, and eventually a volcano named Zitl erupted and buried parts of it under lava. Its population collapsed during roughly the same window when Teotihuacan, previously a modest settlement, was growing dramatically. The traditional inference is that refugees from Cuicuilco, along with migrants from other parts of the basin, fed Teotihuacan's rise, bringing their labor and their religion with them. More recent work has complicated this picture, since the timing of the eruption and the population shift isn't as tidy as older textbooks suggested. However, most researchers still accept that the two cities' trajectories were connected in some way. Even so, that doesn't tell us who those people actually were, ethnically or linguistically. Some have suggested they were early Nahua people, whose ancestral lineage would eventually produce the Aztecs themselves. Others would suggest they were a people who were related to the Olmecs, the civilization known for producing elaborate giant stone heads. Still others have suggested the city was founded by the Otomi, a group from central Mexico, who have carried on their traditions until the present day. The honest answer is that we don't know, and the evidence for each candidate is frustratingly thin. Part of the difficulty is that Teotihuacan never left behind a decipherable writing system. The Maya, by contrast, left a fully narrative script that scholars cracked in the late 20th century, opening up royal biographies and dynastic histories in startling detail. Teotihuacan had glyphs. Painted symbols appear on murals, ceramics, and architectural elements. But the system, if it was a complete system at all, remains unread, and no one has been able to crack it, not Aztec scholars, Spanish priests, or modern historians. Researchers can identify names of places, possibly of people, and certain calendrical or ritual ideas, but there's no Rosetta Stone. The glyphs may never have been used for long narrative text in the first place. Some specialists suspect Teotihuacan deliberately rejected the kind of personality-driven political history that the Maya embraced. If this is accurate, they preferred anonymous depictions of gods and ceremonies over portraits of named rulers. That decision, if it was one the leaders of the civilization took, may be the single most frustrating thing about the city. The murals that survive show jaguars drinking from ornate vessels, processions of priests, and elaborate depictions of the storm god, the feathered serpent, a great goddess figure, and more. What we don't have is the name of a single ruler we can confidently say actually lived. In 2003, a Mexican archaeologist named Sergio Gomez Chavez was investigating subsidence near the Temple of the Feathered Serpent when a sinkhole opened up in front of him. It led into a tunnel, and what followed was probably the most significant Teotihuacan discovery in a century. After more than a decade of painstaking excavation, the passage turned out to be a ritual corridor running almost 40 feet underground. The path terminated in a series of chambers directly beneath the temple. Inside, researchers recovered tens of thousands of objects, including jade statues, conch shells, obsidian blades, carved animal bones, and, most astonishingly, pools of liquid mercury. The mercury, some have proposed, may have been intended to simulate a reflective underworld lake, a mirror of the cosmos beneath the temple floor. The tunnel also yielded 4 unusual greenstone figurines, possibly representing founders or deified ancestors. Some researchers have speculated that the chambers once held a royal burial, the body long since removed by ancient looters. Others argue the space was always symbolic, a stage for ritual rather than a tomb. Either way, the find has substantially changed our understanding of what the people of Teotihuacan believed about caves, death, and the underworld. It also hinted that real answers about the city's founders might still lie buried somewhere beneath it. Recent isotopic and genetic work has added another complication. Analysis of human remains recovered from sacrificial deposits within the Pyramid of the Moon and elsewhere has shown that many of the people ritually executed there weren't locals. Many had grown up elsewhere, traced to the Maya region, the Gulf Coast, or parts of western Mexico. Teotihuacan's elites, in other words, appear to have been drawing captives, tributaries, or high-status emissaries from across Mesoamerica, and, in certain cases, offering them up on the altar. The Moon Pyramid itself turned out to be a stacked record of this practice. A team began tunneling into the structure in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and they uncovered a sequence of dedicatory burials. Each was laid down during successive phases of construction, and the remains of bound sacrificial victims lay surrounded by jaguars, pumas, wolves, and eagles. Notably, some of them were apparently entombed alive in wooden cages. Whatever spiritual grammar governed these rituals, major building events at Teotihuacan were clearly accompanied by bloodletting on an industrial scale. Meanwhile, genetic studies of ordinary residents in the apartment compounds suggest a remarkably diverse population, with ancestry spread across central Mexico and further afield. This fits the picture of a cosmopolitan imperial capital, something closer to a Mesoamerican Rome than the homogeneous tribal center earlier generations of scholars sometimes imagined. That said, unlike Rome, the core group of people who formed the elite of the civilization aren't understood, and it matters for a reason I'll explain in a moment. There's also the matter of how the city fell into ruins in the first place, and that part we understand decently well. Sometime in the mid-6th century, the city burned. Well, decently is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, since we understand the mechanics of it more than we do many aspects of the city. The destruction was concentrated on civic and ceremonial buildings, including palaces, temples, and the houses of the elite, while ordinary residential districts were mostly spared. That's perhaps the kind of damage pattern scholars would expect from an internal revolt, rather than a foreign invasion. Something happened inside Teotihuacan, possibly after a prolonged drought had weakened its agricultural base. This in turn perhaps drove its own people to turn on their rulers and raise the institutions that governed them. The population drained gradually away over the following century, and by the time the Aztecs arrived, only scattered farmers remained inhabiting the ruins. In terms of the historical mystery here, we're left with a city built by people we can't name and speaking a language we can't identify. They worshipped gods whose titles we only recognize because later peoples borrowed them and adapted them into their own mythos. The Aztecs walked through those ruins and guessed, and so did the Spanish chroniclers who came after them. Generations of 20th century archaeologists guessed, revised, and guessed again. Every few years, a new discovery, whether it's a tunnel, a buried cache, or a fresh batch of isotope data, reshuffles the deck. The most honest response to the question of who built Teotihuacan is that the city was almost certainly founded by a coalition rather than a single people. It may have been seeded with refugees from Cuicuilco and then been swelled by migrants from Oaxaca and the Gulf Coast and the Maya lowlands. It was ruled by an elite whose individual identities remained deliberately veiled behind anonymous art. Those Cuicuilco refugees, once meager, may have formed a powerful hereditary ruling class, but we don't know for sure. Teotihuacan was, in a sense, everybody and nobody, and it may be the first truly cosmopolitan capital in the history of the Americas. Long before scientists arrived at a quiet hillside southwest of Beijing, locals already knew something strange was buried in the earth. They called the place Dragon Bone Hill, named for the peculiar bones that kept turning up in the limestone, which villagers sold to apothecaries as traditional medicine. What they didn't realize was that those bones belonged to creatures far more significant than any mythical dragon. In 1918, Swedish geologist Johan Gunnar Andersson was directed to a fossil-rich cave system near the town of Zhoukoudian, roughly 50 kilometers from Beijing. By 1921, Andersson and Austrian paleontologist Otto Zadansky had begun formal excavations, and Zadansky quietly discovered a human tooth at the site. When he finally reported the find in 1926, the scientific community took notice. Canadian anatomist Davidson Black, working at the Peking Union Medical College, secured Rockefeller Foundation funding to launch a systematic excavation. Based on isolated teeth, Black classified the specimens as a new genus and species in 1927, calling it Sinanthropus pekinensis. It was a gutsy move based on very little physical evidence, but Black was convinced something monumental lay waiting in the caves. He wasn't wrong, and on December 2nd, 1929, Chinese geologist Pei Wenzhong made the breakthrough. Working deep inside a frigid 40-meter crevasse with nothing but a hammer and a candle, Pei extracted a nearly complete skull cap from the red sandy clay. It was the first substantial cranial evidence of what we now classify as Homo erectus ever found in China. The discovery electrified the paleontological world and reshaped conversations about human evolution. Over the following years, excavations at Zhoukoudian yielded an extraordinary haul. By 1937, scientists had recovered over 200 fossils from more than 40 individuals, including 5 nearly complete skull caps, numerous teeth, jawbones, and limb fragments. They also found thousands of stone tools and evidence of controlled fire use, painting a rich picture of early hominids who had inhabited these caves around 500,000 years ago. Davidson Black didn't live to see his life's work threatened. He died of a heart attack at his desk in 1934, reportedly with one of the skull caps sitting right in front of him. German anatomist Franz Weidenreich, who had fled Germany, was appointed to continue the research. Weidenreich proved meticulous, overseeing the creation of detailed plaster casts, photographs, and scientific illustrations of every specimen. This painstaking documentation would later prove to be an act of extraordinary foresight, given the uncertainty and conflict that was on the horizon. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper after having previously invaded Manchuria about a half-decade earlier, and excavations at Zhoukoudian ground to a halt. Reports emerged of brutal treatment of workers at the site, including the slaying of at least 3 laborers by Japanese soldiers. As the conflict intensified, the safety of the fossils became urgent. Weidenreich transferred the collection to a safe at the Peking Union Medical College, hoping an American-run institution would offer protection. He figured that the Japanese wouldn't be silly enough to attack an American college in China and bring down the full force of the United States on the island. But despite believing in his plan, Weidenreich repeatedly urged college head Henry Houghton to authorize shipping the fossils to the United States just in case. Houghton initially refused, and it wasn't until September 1941 that the U.S. Embassy finally authorized the transfer. Weidenreich departed China that year, taking his casts and research notes to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. What happened next remains one of the most agonizing mysteries in the history of science. In late November 1941, the fossils were carefully wrapped in cotton, tissue paper, and gauze, then packed into 2 wooden military footlockers. The plan was straightforward. U.S. Marines would transport the crates from the Peking Union Medical College to the port city of Qinhuangdao. There they'd be loaded onto the SS President Harrison and shipped to the American Museum of Natural History. The fossils left the college on December 4th, 1941, and 3 days later was December 7th, which, to quote Roosevelt, was a day that would live in infamy. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the SS President Harrison was intercepted by Japanese ships and ran aground before it could reach port. The Marines who were supposed to oversee the fossils' safe passage were taken prisoner, and the 2 footlockers containing the remains of at least 40 Homo erectus simply vanished. No one has ever definitively established what happened to them after they left the medical college that December morning. Japanese scientists, who had coveted the collection, raided the laboratory shortly after and were reportedly furious to find the fossils gone. They had planned on using these fossils to prove that humans came from Asia, with the intent being to prove that the Japanese were the most superior of all. An American lab associate was held and interrogated for 5 days about their whereabouts, but he couldn't provide answers because he genuinely didn't know where they'd ended up. In the decades since then, theories about the fossils' fate have multiplied. Some researchers believe the crates made it as far as Camp Holcomb, the Marine base near Qinhuangdao, but were never loaded onto a ship due to the chaos of the Pearl Harbor attack. If that's the case, an officer may have buried them near one of the camp's permanent structures, intending to retrieve them later but never surviving to do so. Others have speculated that Japanese soldiers intercepted the crates during transport and either confiscated the contents or, not recognizing their value, discarded them. One persistent rumor suggests the fossils ended up aboard the Japanese vessel Awa Maru, which was sunk by an American submarine in 1945. Another disturbing theory holds that the bones were ground up and sold as traditional medicine, their scientific significance completely unknown to whoever possessed them. The search efforts over the years have been colorful to say the least, and oddly various federal agencies have investigated leads at various points. A mysterious woman claiming to be the widow of one of the Marines guarding the fossils once met a Chicago businessman at the top of the Empire State Building. She showed him photographs she said depicted the missing bones and then vanished forever. Other verified con artists periodically surfaced claiming to possess the fossils, demanding million-dollar ransoms. One desperate researcher even enlisted a professional psychic who had previously attempted to locate Bigfoot using a dowsing rod. Unsurprisingly, though, none of these less conventional efforts produced results. The most credible lead emerged in 2010 when paleoanthropologist Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa received an email out of the blue. It was from Paul Bowen, son of former Marine Corporal Richard Bowen. The elder Bowen hadn't been at Camp Holcomb when the fossils first went missing in 1941. He'd been stationed there in 1947 during the Chinese Civil War, when the camp was caught between nationalist and communist forces. According to his account, while digging foxholes one night, as the base came under attack from tens of thousands of communist soldiers, he unearthed a wooden crate filled with bones. Under fire, he reburied the box and used it as a makeshift machine gun nest, after which he was captured shortly afterward and never returned. Berger verified Bowen's identity and military records, then traveled to Qinhuangdao, where he linked up with Chinese scholars. A local historian, who actually remembered the American Marines, helped them locate the former site of Camp Holcomb, and what they found was disheartening. The area had been completely industrialized, covered in warehouses, roads, and asphalt. The most probable location of the buried crate now sits beneath a parking lot. The team couldn't excavate, but noted the area was slated for redevelopment, which could allow for future investigation. Local cultural heritage authorities committed to monitoring any construction for signs of the footlockers. However, many people have questioned whether a developer who came upon these priceless cultural artifacts would turn them over to the authorities. After all, this would be the permanent end to any development on the site, with no guarantee of any sort of recourse against the government. The loss of the Peking man fossils is often called one of the greatest tragedies in science history. They represented the largest collection of Homo erectus remains ever found at a single site. No chemical analysis or advanced testing was ever performed on the originals before they disappeared, meaning entire categories of scientific inquiry were closed. Modern techniques like DNA extraction and isotopic analysis could reveal extraordinary information about these early humans that simply can't be obtained from plaster casts. Yet there's a small consolation in Weidenreich's extreme thoroughness and dedication to the project. His casts, photographs, and detailed illustrations preserved enough information that the loss didn't entirely halt scientific progress. Further yet, there's a common misconception that all the bones from the site were permanently lost, which isn't true, even if the vast majority were. Excavations at Zhoukoudian resumed after order had been restored to China and continued through subsequent decades, yielding additional specimens. But like I said, these are a small fraction of what was available, and whether the full trove will ever be recovered is anyone's guess. In November of 1930, a Canadian fur trapper named Joe Lebel made his way across the frozen landscape of what was then the Northwest Territories. He was heading toward a small Inuit settlement on the shores of Lake Anjikuni, and Lebel knew the village well. He'd passed through before on his trapping routes, and had always been greeted warmly by its inhabitants. It was a community of roughly 25 people who lived off the land in one of the most remote corners of the continent. The area around Lake Anjikuni, now part of the Kivalik region of Nunavut, is a vast stretch of the Canadian Shield, scraped flat by ancient glaciers and dotted with lakes and rivers. It's the kind of place where the cold winds can erase absolutely everything beneath them. In November, the average temperature stays well below freezing, and the lake itself becomes an unbroken sheet of ice indistinguishable from the barren tundra surrounding it. This was the world LaBelle walked into, expecting a hot meal and a warm place to sleep. What he found instead was silence. According to the account that would eventually reach print, LaBelle called out as he approached the settlement but received no response. He moved through the village and discovered it completely abandoned with the tents and shelters still intact. Unfinished garments lay with needles still threaded through the fabric, and old food hung over fire pits where the flames had long since gone out. Personal belongings and provisions remained undisturbed, as though the inhabitants had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of their daily routines. More disturbing still, LaBelle reportedly found the bodies of 7 sled dogs that had starved to death, still tethered to their posts. And then there was the grave. At least one burial site had been opened and emptied, with the stones that once encircled it still carefully in place, suggesting no animal had done the digging. LaBelle, shaken by what he'd seen, made his way to the nearest telegraph office and contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is the story as it's often told, but upon further examination of the historical record, there's something more going on here. The earliest known published account of this incident appeared in the November 27, 1930 edition of the Danville Bee, a newspaper out of, you guessed it, Danville, in Virginia. The article was written by a journalist named Emmett Keller, who identified himself as a special correspondent. Keller's version described a village of about 25 people, mentioned the dead dogs and the emptied grave, and included a generic stock photograph of an Inuit village. For decades, this article was mistakenly attributed to the Halifax Herald, a confusion that persisted until researchers traced the original to its correct source. Keller's piece was relatively restrained compared to what would come later, but it contained enough eerie detail to catch a reader's imagination. Not long after, on January 17, 1931, a formal investigation of the story was conducted by an officer known as Nelson. Nelson had spoken with local traders and determined that Joe LaBelle was indeed a real person who worked as a trapper in northern Manitoba and traveled further north regularly. However, no one in the region had heard of this village or its alleged disappearance. Nelson also discovered that the photograph Keller used was a stock photograph, despite being presented as the real deal in the article. Based on these findings, Nelson concluded that the entire story was a sensationalized fabrication, likely invented or heavily embellished by Keller. The authorities filed the matter away, and for nearly 3 decades, the story of Lake Anjikuni essentially disappeared from public consciousness. The story might have stayed buried if not for a man named Frank Edwards. Edwards was an American writer and radio broadcaster who'd built a career around tales of the unexplained. In 1959, he published a book called Stranger Than Science, a collection of short accounts of paranormal events and unsolved mysteries. These were drawn largely from his syndicated radio program, where he had related these stories to his audience for years. Edwards devoted 3 pages to the Lake Anjikuni disappearance, slightly inflating the village's population from 25 to about 30. He described the scene LaBelle allegedly encountered in vivid terms, detailing the abandoned meals, the frozen dog carcasses, and the baffling absence of any explanation. Edwards offered no sources and made no reference to either the 1930 newspaper article or the 1931 investigation. His version read like a campfire tale polished for a national audience, and it worked. The book was a bestseller, and the Lake Anjikuni story was reborn. For the next 17 years or so, the story circulated quietly through books about the paranormal, but nobody added anything particularly new. That changed in November 1976, when a writer named Dwight Whalen published a cover story in Fate magazine titled Vanished Village Revisited. Whalen was apparently the first person to track down the original 1930 newspaper article and the 1931 police report, connecting dots that Edwards had either overlooked or chosen to ignore. When Whalen contacted the authorities directly, he was told they had no record of any unusual event at Lake Anjikuni. Whalen's conclusion was cautious but pointed, and he suggested the whole story was likely invented by Keller. In the alternative, he thought it was possibly based on a tall tale he'd heard from LaBelle, who may or may not have stumbled upon the genuine remains of an abandoned camp. After all, this may provide a reason how LaBelle, who was confirmed by the 1931 investigation to be a real person active in the area, came into the story. That said, to me, Joe LaBelle sounds like the most stereotypical Canadian fur trapper name possible, so it's theoretically possible that it's a coincidence. Things took a sharp turn into the bizarre in April 1977 when a reader wrote to Fate magazine disputing Whalen's conclusions, and this was no ordinary individual. That reader was Betty Hill, one half of the most famous alleged alien abduction case in history. Hill claimed that she and her husband Barney had once met a Captain Larson on a ferry at the Bay of Fundy. Larson, according to her, was a former Mountie that had spent 9 years investigating the Anjikuni disappearance. According to Hill, Larson believed the villagers had been abducted by beings from another planet. Whether or not this encounter actually happened, the letter served as the catalyst to change the story into something more. From that point forward, writers began folding the Anjikuni story into their work, each time adding a little more to it. The most dramatic escalation came in 1983, when Nigel Blundell and Roger Bohr published The World's Great Mysteries. Their version inflated the village population from 30 to an astonishing 1,200, a number which is still thrown about. And while 1,200 people might sound like a village anywhere else, in the area that's now Nunavut, it would have been one of the largest settlements at the time. They also introduced a new element entirely in the form of even more French-Canadian fur trappers. Armand Laurent and his 2 sons allegedly witnessed a large cylindrical object in the sky that transformed into a bullet shape before flying toward the lake. This detail had never appeared in any earlier version of the story, and the sourcing on the claim is non-existent. The book also added claims about entire cemeteries being emptied of their dead, far more dramatic than the single disturbed grave in Keller's original account. With each retelling, the story grew, and the line between what LaBelle may have actually reported and what was invented by subsequent authors became increasingly impossible to trace. A number of investigators have attempted to debunk the Anjikuni story by focusing on small factual inconsistencies in the various retellings. They point to things like environmental details, materials used in kayaks, and changing population figures across different versions of the account. These critics argue that such discrepancies suggest the story evolved through retellings rather than reflecting a literal historical event. Personally, though, I'm not particularly interested in that kind of granular nitpicking. Minor inconsistencies and shifting details are common in stories that circulate over time, and focusing too heavily on them can miss the broader narrative or cultural significance of the tale. That said, I think we can actually look to the evidence to figure out what kernel of truth may exist in this story, if there is indeed any at all. One possibility is that LaBelle did encounter an abandoned campsite, but that the abandonment wasn't mysterious at all. The Inuit of the Central Arctic were semi-nomadic, moving seasonally to follow caribou herds and to access different resources at different times of year. A camp that appeared suddenly empty to an outsider might simply have been one that its inhabitants had left on schedule, taking what they needed and leaving behind what they didn't. The dead sled dogs, if they existed, could point to an emergency departure driven by disease, a failed hunt, or a dispute within the group. Camps were sometimes abandoned quickly when conditions demanded it, and items that were unnecessary for the journey ahead would be left behind. As for the disturbed grave, this too has some potentially mundane explanations. Permafrost burial practices in the Arctic sometimes involved shallow interment covered with stones. These graves could be disturbed by natural forces, by animals, or even by other Inuit following cultural practices unfamiliar to a European trapper. LaBelle's assertion that the stones around the grave were undisturbed doesn't necessarily mean human hands weren't involved. It simply means he couldn't identify the cause. It's plausible that LaBelle found something genuinely unsettling, something he couldn't explain with his own experience, and that the story grew from there. Keller, a journalist looking for a dramatic dispatch from the north, would have had every incentive to sharpen the edges and lean into the mystery. What makes the Lake Anjikuni story endure isn't the strength of the evidence, it's the image. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of an entire community vanishing in the middle of ordinary life, leaving behind the half-finished evidence of their existence. It taps into a primal fear of abandonment and erasure, the idea that a person or a people can simply be wiped from the earth without explanation. That fear is amplified by the setting, a landscape so vast and so empty that it feels as though it could swallow anything without leaving a trace. The story also endures because it's been so useful to so many different kinds of storytellers. The original Keller article provides enough evidence to suggest that something happened that anyone interested in the unexplained can slot their own theories into the few facts. Of course, it appears to me that Blundell and Bohr, or perhaps their publisher, wanted something a bit spicier than the subtly mysterious version originally told by Keller. For what it's worth, the Mounties today maintain that the entire incident is an urban legend, and in all likelihood, they're right. The chain of evidence leads back to a single newspaper article written by a journalist whose credibility was questioned almost immediately. Unusual for a case like this is that the Mounties actually investigated the claims almost immediately, who discounted Keller's report. But at the very heart of it, there's likely a real historical event that happened, involving a somewhat mysterious fur trader named Joe LaBelle and a vanishing Inuit camp. For centuries, the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall was a whispered legend, confined to the corridors of a Norfolk mansion. Then, in 1936, two photographers claimed they captured her on film, and the Brown Lady became arguably the most famous ghost in the history of photography of the era. Most accounts trace the identity of the Brown Lady to Lady Dorothy Walpole, the sister of Sir Robert Walpole, who's widely considered Britain's first Prime Minister. Dorothy married Charles Townshend, the second Viscount Townshend, in 1713. It was actually her second marriage, as she'd previously been married to a man who died young. By most historical records, the marriage to Townshend was deeply troubled. Townshend was known for his volatile temper, and there were persistent rumors that he kept Dorothy locked away in Raynham Hall after discovering she'd been unfaithful. Some versions of the story claim she was confined to a set of rooms and forbidden from seeing her children. She died in 1726, and the official cause was listed as smallpox, though skeptics over the centuries have questioned whether her death was quite so straightforward. The nickname itself comes from the brown brocade dress the figure is said to wear when she appears. Witnesses across multiple generations described seeing a woman in a brown gown drifting through the halls and staircases of Raynham Hall. The earliest reported encounters with the Brown Lady date to the early 19th century, though it's likely the stories circulated privately among servants and family members before. During a Christmas gathering in 1835, one Colonel Loftus, a guest at the estate, claimed he saw the apparition on 2 separate nights. He described her as a woman of aristocratic bearing wearing a brown satin dress, but what disturbed him most were her eyes. He said the figure's eye sockets appeared dark and hollow, as though the eyes themselves had been gouged out. His account was considered credible enough at the time that local artists were commissioned to paint the figure based on his description. Unfortunately, this painting appears to have not been notable enough at the time, and it slipped into the spooky realm of lost media. Either that, or it's just not notable enough to have been digitized. Take your pick. But hey, it's my video, and I'm going for historical lost media on Vibes alone. Another notable encounter involved Captain Frederick Marryat, a celebrated Royal Navy officer and novelist, who was no stranger to danger or deception. Marryat reportedly stayed at Raynham Hall specifically because he was skeptical of the ghost stories and wanted to debunk them. He was, by all accounts, a practical man who had faced storms at sea and combat, and he found the idea of a ghost in a country house rather absurd. According to the account, the captain encountered the apparition in a hallway one night, and what he did next is honestly kind of hilarious and lends credence to the story in my view. He claimed the figure grinned at him in a diabolical fashion, and in a moment of panic, he fired his pistol directly at her. The bullet passed through the specter and lodged in a door behind her. Whether Marryat's account is entirely reliable has been debated, but it added a vivid and dramatic chapter to the Brown Lady's growing legend. The moment that transformed the Brown Lady from a regional ghost story into an international sensation came on September 19, 1936. Captain Provand and Inder Shira, 2 photographers working for Country Life magazine, were at Raynham Hall to photograph the interiors for a feature article. The assignment was routine architectural documentation, the kind of work the magazine published regularly to showcase Britain's grand estates. As Provand set up a shot of the oak staircase, Shira reportedly noticed a veiled, luminous figure descending the steps. He urged Provand to take the photograph immediately, and Provand, though he hadn't seen anything himself, complied. When the plate was developed, it appeared to show a translucent, ghostly figure on the staircase, draped in what looked like a white veil or shroud. The image was first published in Country Life on December 1st, 1936, and it caused an immediate stir. It was subsequently picked up by newspapers and paranormal publications around the world. The photograph remains one of the most widely reproduced and debated images in the history of the paranormal. Also, if you're just listening, now would be the time to look and check out this picture and see what you think for yourself. Skeptics have naturally offered alternative explanations, varying in their potential plausibility. Some photographic experts have suggested the image could be the result of double exposure, a smear of grease on the lens, or light leaking onto the plate during development. Others have pointed out that the figure's appearance doesn't closely match the traditional description of the Brown Lady in her brown dress. Notably, the ghost in the photograph appears in white, and according to some sources, she appears to be wearing a veil. Whether what's actually being seen is an outline of a veil, or just her hair is open to interpretation in my view. The most interesting theory is that this photograph is a simple overlay of a statue of the Madonna on the staircase, a hypothesis that I find fairly alluring. Defenders of the photograph's authenticity have noted that Provand and Shira maintained their account consistently and claimed neither photographer had a known motive for fabrication. They've also noted that there has been no definitive debunking of the photograph, despite it being nearly a century old. What makes the Brown Lady endure isn't just the photograph, though that certainly helped cement her place in the paranormal canon. It's the depth of the historical narrative behind her. If Dorothy Walpole truly was imprisoned in her own home, cut off from her children, and left to die in isolation, then the ghost story becomes something more than a campfire tale. It becomes a story about injustice, about suffering, and about the refusal to be forgotten. The aristocratic setting of Raynham Hall, with its imposing facade and centuries of accumulated power, adds a layer of Gothic weight that few haunted houses can match. The Townshend family has largely been private about the ghost stories, neither aggressively promoting nor categorically denying the haunting. Raynham Hall isn't a tourist attraction in the way that some allegedly haunted properties have become, which lends it a kind of restraint that makes it more compelling rather than less. Reports of sightings have diminished significantly since the mid-20th century, leading some to speculate that whatever energy was behind the manifestation has dissipated. Others take a more pragmatic view and suggest that the legend simply ran its natural course as the cultural appetite for Victorian-style ghost stories waned. Personally, though, this ghost attracted my attention due to its relation to important figures in British history and the narrative that goes along with it. Long before Hollywood existed and before the Lumiere brothers screened their famous footage of workers leaving a factory, a French-born inventor had done something extraordinary. He'd captured the world's first moving pictures while he was working in his workshop in Leeds in England. His name was Louis-Aimé Augustin Leprince, and by the autumn of 1890, he was preparing to show his invention to the world, but he never got the chance. On September 16th of that year, Leprince stepped onto a train in Dijon, France, and vanished without a trace. His body was never found, his luggage was never recovered, and more than a century later, nobody can say for certain what happened to him. Leprince was born in Metz, France, in 1841, the son of an artillery officer in the French army. His father's close friend happened to be Louis Daguerre, the man widely credited with inventing the daguerreotype photographic process. As a boy, Leprince reportedly spent time in Daguerre's studio, absorbing early lessons in chemistry and photography that would profoundly shape the entire course of his life. He went on to study painting in Paris and postgraduate chemistry at the University of Leipzig in Germany. While this may sound odd, this gave him a rare and potent combination of artistic sensibility and rigorous scientific knowledge. In the 1860s, Leprince moved to England, where he married Elizabeth Whitley, a talented artist from Leeds. Together they founded the Leeds Technical School of Art and built a reputation for their innovative work in fixing colored photographs onto metal and pottery. Their clients included Queen Victoria and Prime Minister William Gladstone. But despite this big league patronage, Leprince had financial troubles, a fact that'll be important shortly. Eventually, the family relocated to New York, where Leprince managed a group of French artists specializing in panoramic paintings. But throughout all of this, his mind was consumed by a singular obsession: capturing and reproducing motion on film. His wallet was also consumed by it as well, because those financial troubles didn't come from mismanagement, but from reinvesting every penny back into his film obsession. In January 1888, Leprince was granted an American patent for a 16-lens camera device that he intended to function as both a motion picture camera and a projector. But it was his subsequent work with a single-lens camera that proved revolutionary. On October 14, 1888, in the garden of Oakwood Grange in Roundhay in Leeds, the home of his wife's parents, Leprince used this camera to film. That work would be what's now known as the Roundhay Garden scene. The short clip shows his son, his father-in-law Joseph Whitley, his mother-in-law, and a family friend walking and laughing in the garden. It lasts only roughly 2 seconds, but it's arguably the oldest surviving motion picture in existence. During that same period, Le Prince also filmed his son playing an accordion, and at some point in the following months, captured footage of horse-drawn traffic crossing Leeds Bridge. Those close to him later testified that he'd successfully projected these films in his workshop, though no public demonstration ever took place. Le Prince was a perfectionist, and he wouldn't show his work until he was absolutely certain it functioned flawlessly. Over the next 2 years, he continued refining his equipment, converting from paper film stock to celluloid, and improving his projector designs with the help of his assistant. By 1890, Le Prince was finally ready for a public display in New York City. But then, just like that, the pioneering Frenchman disappeared. In September 1890, Le Prince traveled to France following the death of his mother to visit his brother Albert in Dijon and settle family affairs. On the 16th, Albert allegedly accompanied him to the Dijon train station, where Le Prince boarded an express train bound for Paris. Notably, Albert was the only person who witnessed this event, a fact that has drawn suspicion now for over a century, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Le Prince was carrying his luggage and reportedly had materials related to his patents with him, though this has never been confirmed with absolute certainty. Friends were waiting to meet him in Paris before he continued on to England and then sailed to New York for his planned demonstration. He never arrived, and when the train pulled into Paris, Le Prince wasn't on it. His friends searched for him, but there was no sign of the inventor. No fellow passenger reported seeing him aboard the train. Given that Le Prince stood roughly 6 feet 3 inches tall and wore distinctive mutton chop sideburns, he wasn't someone who blended easily into a crowd. Both the French police and Scotland Yard launched investigations, but neither turned up a single lead. No body, no belongings, no witnesses, nothing. In 1897, 7 years after his disappearance, Le Prince was officially declared dead under French law. The vacuum left by Le Prince's disappearance has been filled with speculation ever since. Several competing theories have emerged over the decades, though none of them conclusively proven. The most sensational theory points the finger at Thomas Edison. Le Prince's widow, Elizabeth, was the most vocal proponent of this idea. She believed Edison had Le Prince kidnapped and slain to eliminate a competitor. Just weeks after Le Prince vanished, Edison filed a preliminary patent application for a motion picture camera that bore a striking resemblance to Le Prince's design. By May 1891, Edison's workers publicly debuted the kinetograph, and Edison went on to claim he was the sole inventor of cinematography. He aggressively used the patent system to assert dominance over the fledgling film industry, suing competitors into submission. However, no hard evidence has ever directly connected Edison or anyone in his employ to Le Prince's disappearance. Personally, I would dismiss this hypothesis completely, since while we know that Edison was willing to crush the competition, he always did it by the letter of the law. Another theory focuses on Le Prince's brother, Albert, and this is the idea that I personally prefer. He was the last person known to have seen Le Prince alive, and there was a financial dispute between them over their mother's estate. By 1890, Le Prince had accumulated extremely significant debts working on his various projects. Albert was the executor of their mother's will, and Le Prince was owed money that Albert appeared reluctant to pay. Some historians have speculated that the dispute turned violent, and that Albert's account of waving his brother off at the station may have been fabricated. However, surviving letters between the brothers suggest a warm relationship, and Le Prince's descendants have pushed back against this theory. That said, nothing comes between a happy family relationship like money, and Albert stood to benefit massively if his brother went missing. But while I did say this is the theory I prefer, it's entirely circumstantial, and I fully admit that there's no hard evidence for it. I do find it very odd that no one on the train saw Le Prince, though, given how unusually tall he was, especially for the time. For decades, Le Prince's contributions were largely forgotten, and Thomas Edison received credit in America, while the Lumiere brothers took their share of the spoils in France. It wasn't until the 1920s that serious attention returned to Le Prince's work, and recognition has grown steadily since. In 1930, a bronze memorial plaque was unveiled at his former workshop on Woodhouse Lane in Leeds. The University of Leeds later named its Center for Cinema, Photography, and Television after him. At the end of the day, the story of Louis Le Prince is one of remarkable genius, overshadowed by enduring mystery. He created the world's first moving pictures, years ahead of the famous names that would eventually receive the credit for his pioneering work. Whatever happened on that fateful September day in 1890, this inventor of cinema left behind a transformative invention that helped change the world forever. There was a country so convinced that it could bend nature to the will of its leader that it formally declared war on 4 living things. Not in metaphor, but in an actual state-organized, nationwide military fashion, complete with slogans, quotas, marching orders, recruitment drives, and a body count. 3 of those enemies were the kinds of creatures almost any government might reasonably try to reduce: rats, flies, and mosquitoes. The 4th was a songbird that weighs about as much as a couple of coins in your pocket. This is the story of how, in the late 1950s, Mao Zedong's China turned hundreds of millions of its own citizens into a volunteer army aimed at the total extermination of a grain-eating sparrow. It's also the story of how that conflict became one of the most humiliating, self-inflicted ecological disasters in human history. Mao's government managed, in the space of a handful of months, to wipe out what credible researchers estimate to have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 billion birds. Then people noticed that common insects were ticking upwards rapidly, and then just like that, the locusts came. Then those locusts and insects caused the harvests to fail, which caused hundreds of millions of people to starve. The truly strange part is that a group of Chinese scientists, quiet and terrified, had been standing in the background the whole time, trying to explain what happens if you eliminate sparrows. But in Mao's China, the tape measure of reality was whatever the chairman said it was, and the chairman had decided the sparrow had to go. So with that, let's talk about the 4 Pests campaign, and the time the most populous country in the world won the ultimate Pyrrhic victory against a bird dubbed counter-revolutionary vermin. By 1958, the People's Republic of China was less than a decade old. The Communist Party had taken Beijing in 1949 after a long, grinding conflict with the nationalists. In the years that followed, Mao and the party set about reshaping the country on a scale that modern audiences sometimes struggle to visualize. Landlords were eliminated, and private farms were folded into collectives, while industry was centralized under state planning. An entire economic and social order was being torn down and rebuilt at breakneck speed, always with ideological fervor, and frequently with horrific human cost. By the mid-1950s, though, Mao had grown impatient. He'd looked at what the Soviets had done under Stalin's 5-year plans, and he wanted more progress, and he wanted it faster. He wanted to leapfrog the industrial development of the West, catch up to Britain within 15 years, and pull China into the modern age through what he called a great leap forward. This was to be a revolution in production, in labor, in agriculture, in every possible sector of Chinese life. It was also, critically, to be a revolution in the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The party's position, stated often and loudly, was that man must conquer nature. There's a Chinese phrase for this idea, a slogan really, that translates to something like, man will triumph over heaven. Heaven, in this context, didn't mean religion, but environment. The weather, the seasons, flooding. The basic rules that governed how crops grew and how animals behaved and how rivers flowed, all of it was going to bend to revolutionary will. Mao himself, according to later accounts, had been one of the personal advocates of the sparrow idea from the very beginning. He'd mentioned the notion of eliminating the birds in conversation with high-level party officials as early as the mid-1950s. The planners who later drew up the Four Pests framework were essentially executing a policy the chairman had already endorsed in principle. If the idea sounds insane when you put it in those terms, it's because it was. But it was also government policy. If you were a peasant in 1958 and an official showed up at your door and told you that the Central Committee had decided sparrows were counter-revolutionary vermin, you didn't argue. The campaign that would eventually become famous as the Four Pests had been simmering for a couple of years before it really took off. What 1958 brought was a massive escalation, and the whole thing shifted from a general cleanup of counter-revolutionary animals into a coordinated national effort. And at the center of the propaganda, above all the other enemies, was the sparrow, a force numbering in the billions, all with their beaks allegedly aimed at the heart of communism itself. The official list of counter-revolutionary pests was, at least at first, straightforward. The four pests the party wanted eliminated were rats, because they spread disease and ate stored grain. Flies were there too, because they spread disease and contaminated food, which again led to more illness. Mosquitoes were an obvious choice because they spread malaria and a host of other illnesses that the government wasn't in the position to deal with. 3 of those 4 were obvious targets for any serious public health effort, and frankly, campaigns against rats, flies, and mosquitoes are absolutely routine. The sparrow was a different animal entirely. The specific species being targeted was the Eurasian tree sparrow. It's a small brown bird with a chestnut cap that's common across most of Europe and Asia. It likes human settlements, and it nests in eaves and cracks in walls, while also absolutely demolishing insects and providing songs as well. But the sparrow forages in fields, along roadsides, and in grain stores, and it eats, along with many other things, some measurable quantity of rice and wheat. Somewhere in the planning stages of the Great Leap Forward, officials at the Chinese Academy of Sciences were asked to estimate how much grain a single sparrow consumed in a year. The figure that came back, repeated endlessly in subsequent propaganda, landed somewhere in the range of 4.5 kilograms of grain per bird per year. That's about 10 pounds if you prefer imperial units, and if you multiply that by the sparrow population of China, the arithmetic starts to look alarming in a hurry. The propaganda ran the numbers out loud. If every million sparrows you eliminated meant roughly 4.5 million kilograms of grain saved, that was tens of thousands of people fed. The sparrow was a thief. The sparrow was stealing food out of the mouths of honest workers. And yes, the sparrow was, in the official framing, a class enemy. Once you're talking about a class enemy in Mao's China, you're no longer talking about wildlife management. You're talking about complete annihilation. The campaign posters made that explicit, and they showed peasants, soldiers, and school children knocking sparrows out of the sky with everything from small arms to slingshots. It's worth pausing on how strange this already is before we get into how the campaign was actually executed. Most governments, when they decide a species has become a problem, authorize some mixture of trapping, poisoning, and perhaps a bounty program. They don't mobilize the civilian population into what amounts to a coordinated national push to physically wipe the species off the map within months. But Mao's China wasn't most governments, and the Great Leap Forward wasn't most policies. Here's the thing about sparrows. You can't shoot your way through a population of billions of them with small arms. Even if you had a well-armed populace with spare ammunition, which China didn't at the time, sparrows are small and fast and alert, and there'd be a lot of waste. You also can't poison them efficiently without poisoning everything else in the food chain along with them. You also can't trap them in the numbers required within the time frame the party wanted. So the question for the Ministry of Public Health became how to handle these birds in the short time frame the chairman wanted. The answer they settled on was grimly clever, and to explain it, you need one piece of sparrow biology. Eurasian tree sparrows aren't long-distance flyers. While they can flutter and dart and weave over short bursts, and they're incredibly nimble near the ground, their stamina in the air is limited, and they need to land and rest. A sparrow in continuous flight will, within a matter of as little as a few minutes depending on conditions, simply run out of gas and fall from the sky. The campaign planners figured this out, and they built the entire national strategy around it. If sparrows needed to land, then the trick was to stop them from landing anywhere at all. The government quickly found out that if you made loud enough noises, the birds would continue flying until they had no stamina left. As part of the national mobilization against this songbird, every person was assigned to a group, and that group was given responsibility for a zone. Within that zone, on coordinated days, tens of thousands of people would fan out into the streets, onto rooftops, into courtyards, and along the edges of fields. They'd make as much noise as possible with anything they could find from sunrise until the birds began to hit the floor. And trust me, the birds did fall. Anything that landed briefly was swarmed, swatted, and finished off, all while children attempted to blast flying ones out of the sky with slingshots. Nests were smashed with poles, and both eggs and chicks were ruthlessly eliminated in an anti-bird frenzy. Prizes were awarded to the sparrow brigades that could accumulate the highest body counts over certain periods of time. Photographs of winning teams ran in the People's Daily, which was the official party newspaper and effectively the voice of the regime. There was something almost festive about it, at least in the propaganda. The campaign was framed as a celebration of revolutionary discipline. It was a chance for school children to do their part alongside their parents, a demonstration of what the proletariat could achieve when it moved as one. The reality, as you'd expect, was a lot of noise and feathers, with bird bodies and smashed eggs accumulating faster than anyone could tally them. The best documented single engagement of the campaign took place on December 13, 1958, in Shanghai. If you want one scene to hold in your head when you think about the four pests, make it this one. The city had been whipped into a frenzy for weeks leading up to the date. Posters were plastered on every available surface. Broadcast vans rolled through neighborhoods reminding residents that the morning of the 13th was the day they were expected to participate. Schools canceled classes and factories released workers, and by most reporting, roughly 3 million people in Shanghai alone took part in the coordinated sparrow hunt that day. Every rooftop in the city had spotters, and every street had mobs with any sort of noisemakers they could get their hands on. Every park was swept by teams armed with poles and nets, and the noise was deafening from before dawn until well after dusk. By the end of that single day, the official tally for Shanghai alone ran to just under 200,000 birds. Similar scenes played out in Beijing, Nanjing, and essentially every urban center in the country. In the countryside, where the bulk of the bird population actually lived, the effort was, if anything, even more total. Peasants reported entire days spent running through rice paddies with poles, chasing sparrows from dawn until the birds collapsed. In some areas, local brigades constructed enormous nets and stretched them across known flight paths. In others, particularly where quotas weren't being met. Poisons were used to supplement the campaign against the creature. This was against official regulations, given the toxicity this presented to all life in the region, but local officials chose to beg forgiveness rather than seek permission. There's one detail from the Beijing campaign that's worth lingering on, because it says something about the strangeness of the whole affair. Certain foreign embassies in the capital became, of all things, safe harbors for innocent sparrows and their families. The campaign could only operate on territory the Chinese government controlled, and diplomatic properties were technically sovereign ground. A few embassies, aware of what was happening, simply locked their gates and allowed the sparrows to live freely inside their walls. This didn't stop fanatical anti-sparrow brigades from making noise outside the embassies, but the sparrows seemed to figure out that they had found a safe harbor. The most famous instance was of the Polish embassy, where the staff apparently had a strong fondness for these creatures, saving thousands of lives. Personally, I like to believe that till this day sparrows have a particular affinity for Poland and the Polish people, though I can't find any confirmation of this in the sources. But hey, if you're watching from Poland, let me know in the comments if you've noticed that the sparrows in your country are unusually friendly or helpful. Estimating the final body count of the sparrow campaign is genuinely difficult, because the record-keeping of the Great Leap Forward ranges somewhere between sloppy and actively falsified. Local officials had strong incentives to inflate their numbers to demonstrate revolutionary zeal. Central planners had strong incentives to repeat those inflated numbers to prove the campaign was working. The press, which was essentially an arm of the party, reported whatever figures it was handed, so the official tallies we have are close to useless for precise accounting. What we can say with confidence is that the numbers were staggering, with the most conservative estimates suggesting a few 100 million birds. Some credible researchers have suggested the total could have been close to 1 billion birds over the full arc of the effort. The exact figure ultimately is unknowable for the reasons described. What's not in dispute is that the sparrow, one of the most abundant bird species in China, was reduced to the edge of local extinction across large parts of the country within roughly a year. And the campaign didn't stop with sparrows either, and the noise and chaos and general wildlife hostility of the period wiped out enormous numbers of other birds too. Anything that nested near human settlements or fed in cultivated fields got caught up in the sweep. It was collateral damage, and in the mindset of the people running the program, these were quite often literal eggs to be broken on the way to cooking the revolutionary omelet. Throughout the whole of the Four Pests campaign, there was one man in China whose job had literally been, for decades, to study the birds of the Chinese countryside. His name was Zheng Zuoxin, and he was, by almost any measure, the most distinguished ornithologist in 20th century Chinese history. He'd studied in the United States in the 1920s, had earned a doctorate at the University of Michigan, and had spent his career cataloging the bird species of China. He'd written the foundational texts on Chinese birds, was hailed as a genius in the field, and let's just say he knew a thing or two about the sparrow. He knew the sparrow's diet, and he knew what the sparrows actually did in the fields. The sparrow wasn't a thief, it was a friend, and the grain it ate was the tax humanity paid to have them eradicate untold trillions of insects per year. Yes, the Eurasian tree sparrow ate grain, and that's where the Academy of Sciences figure about 4.5 kilograms per bird per year had come from. But the calculation that ended up shaping national policy rested on a fundamental, elementary, junior high school level error. It counted only what the sparrow took out of the crop, and it didn't count what the sparrow gave back. The same sparrow that ate grain in late summer also spent the spring, the early summer, and much of the early fall hunting beetles, grasshoppers, caterpillars, and especially locust nymphs. Its diet was mixed, and adult sparrows fed on a combination of seeds and bugs, but they fed their chicks almost entirely on insects since they needed the protein. The fields, in their quiet way, had come to depend on the sparrow's appetite for the bugs, too. Zheng Zuoxin knew all of this in great detail, and he tried, as best he could, to say so. He wrote memos. He quietly told colleagues. He spoke in meetings where speaking was permitted. And for the most part, he was ignored, politely dismissed, or told to keep his thoughts to himself. This wasn't a moment in Chinese history when a well-credentialed scientist could stand up in public and speak the truth. He couldn't directly tell the Central Committee that the chairman's signature agricultural policy rested on a basic arithmetic error. That kind of statement could end your career if you were lucky, and if you picked the wrong day to make it, it could easily end your life. A number of other Chinese scientists and agricultural experts had private misgivings too. Some raised them carefully. A few made tentative suggestions in technical journals about the importance of insect control. A handful were braver or more reckless and said so more loudly, but the campaign had too much political weight behind it. The chairman had decided, the posters were on the walls, the quotas had been set, and the state apparatus lusted for total bird destruction. Zheng Zuoxin himself would live to see the policy reversed and would eventually be recognized as one of the most important naturalists his country had produced. His massive reference work on the birds of China remained the standard in the field for decades. But during the worst years of the campaign, he stayed quiet, as any sensible person in his position would have, and he wrote his papers and did his counts and waited for the weather to change. He'd endure his share of political persecution in the Cultural Revolution too, like most intellectuals of his generation, before being rehabilitated in the Reform period. But for China itself it was too late, and the ghosts of the slain sparrows were about to have their revenge, and these spirits would summon one of the most sinister forces in human history. You don't have to be a professional ecologist to understand the problem that came next. In any given rice paddy or wheat field in China in the 1950s, there was a loose balance of organisms. Plants grew and insects ate the plants, then the birds ate the insects. Other predators, snakes, mice, foxes, ate the birds and the insects, and sometimes the plants too. Everything was pressing against everything else, and the net result was a system that produced enough food to mostly feed a country. Remove one leg of that stool, and specifically remove the most important avian consumer of insects across a massive chunk of the landscape, and the system collapses. In the spring and summer of 1959, the first full growing season after the sparrow campaign really got going, Chinese farmers began to notice that their fields had a problem. Insect populations that had been kept in check for as long as anyone could remember were exploding, and it was locusts in particular. Locust swarms are one of the oldest and most feared agricultural disasters in human history, and sparrows, the alleged counter-revolutionary vermin, had been holding them back. That defense was gone, and the locusts, who presumably didn't know or care about the Great Leap Forward, started doing what locusts do. Fields were stripped, and locusts chewed through rice stalks by the thousands. Caterpillars moved through the grain in waves, consuming absolutely everything in sight, and if you've read the highly acclaimed work on this matter, you know how much they can eat. In some regions, the insect damage to crops in 1959 and 1960 was historically catastrophic, worse than anything the older farmers could remember. Reports of the destruction made their way up the bureaucracy slowly and with deliberate caution. Nobody wanted to be the person who had to tell Beijing that the sparrow policy had been a disaster, because the sparrows had been a personal target of the chairman himself. He had declared the creature to be a counter-revolutionary vermin, a thief, and an enemy of the working class. If you spoke up for the sparrow, then you weren't just speaking up for a bird, but for an enemy of the state and of the revolution itself. But the reports did make it up the chain, and the picture they painted was clear. The bugs had returned in force, and there was nothing left to stop them. By 1960, the situation had become so undeniable that the policy was quietly reversed. The sparrow, after about 2 years as one of the 4 official enemies of the People's Republic, was removed from the list. There wasn't a public apology, and Mao didn't stand in Tiananmen Square and admit an error. The adjustment was made with the characteristic bureaucratic silence of the period. The sparrow was simply dropped, and in its place the bedbug was added to the 4 pests. Bedbugs, unlike sparrows, had the virtue of not being ecologically important, and you could wage a battle with bedbugs for as long as you liked without triggering a famine. It's a small, grim detail of the story, but it's telling. When the system finally admitted it had been wrong about the sparrow, it didn't admit to being wrong. It just swapped one insect for another and kept marching. The bedbug has always been the enemy of the people. The sparrow has always been an ally of the proletariat, working alongside the peasant farmer to ensure prosperity, and you better not question it. The 4 Pests campaign by itself didn't create the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 through 1961. It would be overstating the case and historically inaccurate to pin the loss of tens of millions of lives on the loss of the sparrows alone. The famine was a catastrophe produced by a long list of compounding failures, and to understand it honestly, you have to see the sparrow campaign as one cause among several, not the single cause. The biggest drivers of the famine were the agricultural policies of the Great Leap Forward itself. The forced collectivization of farmland had pushed hundreds of millions of peasants out of their family plots and into communal arrangements. The incentives to work hard and grow carefully had been largely destroyed. Local party officials, under enormous pressure to show that the leap was producing miraculous yields, falsified harvest reports upward. This led the central government to set grain procurement quotas based on harvests that didn't actually exist. Grain was confiscated from villages that had already eaten through most of what they'd grown to be shipped to cities or exported to demonstrate the glorious progress of the revolution. And that last point was major. Mao wanted the world to see China as both powerful and more than self-sufficient. Exporting rice and wheat to other countries sent a very clear message. China's production methods are producing such a large surplus that China could be a breadbasket to the world. There was also the fact that enormous amounts of agricultural labor had been pulled off the land entirely and redirected into a bizarre backyard iron smelting operation. That program produced mostly useless slag, while the already sparrowless crops went unharvested in the fields. Weather problems in some regions compounded the damage. The whole system was brittle, top-down, and structurally incapable of admitting its mistakes. Into that already collapsing system, the disappearance of the sparrows, and with them the explosion of insect damage, landed as one more hammer blow on a structure already starting to come down. The estimates of the human toll from the famine vary widely depending on the methodology, the source, and in many cases, the political orientation of the historian. Chinese scholars working with official population data produced some of the earliest serious estimates, which tended to land in the range of 15 to 30 million excess lives lost. Western historians working with a broader set of sources have sometimes pushed the figure higher, with some estimates running into the mid-40s. A few outliers have also suggested that the real total could be higher still, especially considering the significant efforts to cover up the catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward as a whole. Whatever the exact number, the Great Chinese Famine is one of the most lethal human-made catastrophes in human history. Despite many rural areas of the country absolutely starving, The newspapers ran photographs of bumper harvests, and the propaganda stayed optimistic. The official statistics were revised quietly, sometimes years later, once it became politically safe to admit what had happened. The country's leadership, including Mao personally, has been variously defended and condemned in subsequent decades for what they knew and when they knew it. By the time the dust settled in 1961 and 1962, the Great Leap Forward was effectively finished as an active program. Mao himself had stepped back from day-to-day control of economic policy, and the famine ended and the sparrows, as we'll see, began to come back. The final ironic chapter of the Four Pests campaign is one that doesn't get told nearly often enough, and it's maybe the single detail that captures the whole absurdity of the thing better than any other. Once the Chinese government had figured out, belatedly and in the wake of an insect plague, that the sparrows had actually been useful, it had a problem. The sparrows were mostly gone, and local breeding populations had been reduced to fractions of their former size. In some regions, sparrows had effectively been driven to local extinction, and the recovery of a wild population of a small bird with a short lifespan takes years of leaving the birds alone. In a starving country where people had been taught how to hunt sparrows effectively, this wasn't likely to happen. So China did what, in hindsight, would almost be funny if it wasn't for the human toll involved. The country went shopping for sparrows. In the early 1960s, there are credible reports that the Chinese government arranged for shipments of live Eurasian tree sparrows to be brought in from the Soviet Union. The figure most often cited in the historical literature sits around 250,000 birds imported from the Soviet Far East. Some sources cite smaller numbers and some larger, and the documentation is patchy, as so much of the evidence of this period is. After spending 2 years mobilizing hundreds of millions of its citizens to exterminate the sparrow, it turned around and quietly asked a neighboring country to ship it some sparrows back. It's the kind of policy reversal that in any other political system would have produced inquiries, a few resignations, and perhaps some jail time. In Mao's China, since it was his idea, it produced a quiet freight manifest and a new bird population slowly rebuilding itself in the fields. The sparrows, for their part, did what sparrows do. They bred, they spread, they ate insects, they ate grain. Over the following decades, sparrow populations in China began, very gradually, to recover to something approaching their pre-1958 numbers. To use the terms of a communist regime, the sparrow had been fully rehabilitated as a truly proletariat bird. The final piece of the story, and maybe the real weight of it, is that the sparrow campaign wasn't intentionally malicious, at least against the human populace of China. China had the scientists who could have stopped the catastrophe if they had been listened to, but they weren't. The campaign happened anyway because a political system had been built in which the chairman's instinct outranked any scientific data. It happened in a place and time in which raising your hand to disagree with the policy could end your career or your life. The sparrow itself was the messenger of the sheer stupidity of the policy, gently singing that it was a hard-working friend, not a foe, and the country, at ferocious cost, because of an authoritarian political system, metaphorically and literally, shot that messenger about 1 billion times over. Only when that joyful singing messenger was gone did people begin to realize that they had committed one of the most egregious unforced errors in human history.